My name's Jason Scott-Warren and I'm chairing this evening's meeting. So I was asked to say a few words about myself. I'm a professor of English literature at the university, and I've also been a climate activist involved in non-violent civil disobedience since the terrifying IPCC report of 2018, which led to the formation of Extinction Rebellion. I've been arrested several times and have felt the effects of the numerous changes in legal provisions around protest, whether it's Section 14 of the Public Order Act 1986, which was introduced following the miners' strike, which allows police to ban protest in a particular area, whether it's the Highways Act 1980 with its crime of willful obstruction, against which a well-timed Ziegler defence might have some traction, or whether it's Section 7 of the Public Order Act 2023, which created a crime of interference with key national infrastructure including not just airports and oil terminals, but any A or B road in the land, and latterly any animal testing facility. These successive waves of legislation which we've seen over the last few years have in a way been very flattering to the environmental movement. For a while in 2022-3, it seemed as though the activists of XR, Insulate Britain and Just Stop Oil were actually writing legislation themselves. So quickly did the government move to ban any new form of protest that these groups invented. But the legislation has had a powerful impact in terms of crushing disruptive protest. It has given the police new powers to stop protests within seconds of their eruption, new powers to arrest and imprison people for planning disruptive action, new powers to define disruption as anything that is more than minor. And now we have the spectacle of a Labour government trying to limit access to jury trials, so you can be banged up for up to 3 years merely on the say-so of a judge or a magistrate. Radical action now means holding up a sign, and even that gives you a fair chance of being arrested and perhaps imprisoned. Many protesters have been hit very hard by this legal pushback, this legislative pushback, whether they're mired in fines or whether they're actually imprisoned, like our own Andrew Dames, a Cambridge Quaker who's currently serving a 26-month sentence for taking part in the JSO gantry action. Others, like me, and I'm sure many other people here, have been stopped in their tracks, put out of action as we await our endlessly deferred trials. And some people have grown so used to the effects, to these endless attacks on our liberties, that we now just roll our eyes at them. It's no longer surprising, and we greet them with a kind of resigned despair. And I think that the point of this session, this discussion, is to banish some of that despair, I think, to take stock of where we are, to review the history of protest rights and the removal of those rights under successive governments, and not to think that we have to go mad as a result of the endless gaslighting to which we're subject. And we will remind ourselves, among other things, that we have friends in some very high places. So Michel Forst, the UN Special Rapporteur on Environmental Defenders under the Aarhus Convention, said in February 2024 that states need to address the root causes of environmental mobilization. In other words, not attack the activists, but attack the climate crisis. They need to take action to counter narratives that portray environmental defenders as criminals or as terrorists, and make sure they're not treating civil disobedience as a form of terrorism or of organised crime. It's a really powerful reassertion of the human rights of peaceful assembly and association from Michel Forst. And then more recently, September 2025, in an extraordinary letter to the new Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood, the UN Commissioner for Human Rights, Michael Flaherty, has expressed his concern about the mass arrests of people holding up placards in support of Palestine action. He's called for a review of legislation issued under Priti Patel and Suella Braverman, and raised serious concerns about the Labour Party's new legislation with its ban on masks and face coverings and restrictions on protests in the vicinity of a place of worship, i.e. potentially absolutely anywhere. That's the Crime and Policing Bill 2025. So this is the context for our discussion tonight, and we have three excellent speakers who are going to guide us through some of this terrain to remind us of the ways in which dissent is in danger and to broaden our understanding of why this matters. And our first speaker is Lynn Jones, who is a consultant child and adolescent psychiatrist who has spent much of her life setting up mental health programs in areas of conflict and disaster. When she's not doing that, she's been engaged with nonviolent direct activism to try to prevent these disasters from happening, starting with resigning from her first medical job to live outside a nuclear missile base called Greenham Common in the 1980s. In 2024, she published a book, Sorry for the Inconvenience, but This is an Emergency, The Nonviolent Struggle for Our Planet's Future, which is a personal exploration of nonviolent activism, past and present, an amazing survey of her own life in activism and of what has happened in the history of activism, both distant and very recent. And in this talk, she's going to discuss one of the themes of that book, how methods of repression of nonviolent protest have altered in the last 100 years, and she's hoping to open up a discussion as to what we might do about that. Over to you, Lynn.
Thank you, Jason, for organising this, really, the amazing amount of work. And thank you so much, all of you, for coming. I am so pleased to see wonderful old friends, people I deeply admire here, but also people I've never met before. We have plenty of time for discussion, and I really hope we're going to have a good one because I can learn from you. And so let's first of all go back 200 years, because I think that's a good place to start. St. Peter's Fields in Manchester in 1819, where along with 100,000 men, women, children, you're just peacefully demanding constitutional reform because only 3 to 4% of the population has the right to vote, and your city doesn't even have an MP. And the radical orator Henry Hunt has asked you to come armed with no weapon but that of self-approving conscience, determined not to suffer yourselves to be irritated or excited by any means whatsoever to commit any breach of public peace. And like today's generation of nonviolent protesters, you've done some nonviolence training in advance to keep the protest peaceful. They called it drilling then, but it was completely nonviolent. There are lots of banners: universal suffrage, election by ballot, liberty, fraternity, Parliament's annual. There are no signs of riot. But Manchester magistrates have decided that insurrection is in the air and order the mounted yeomanry and hussars to arrest Hunt and disperse the crowd. And they charge into a packed space wielding sabres, killing at least 18 people, including a child, and wounding 400 to 700 people. So it's very interesting what follows, because actually the pattern of what follows is very much what's going on today. First of all, there was outrage. The public were outraged. The newspapers condemned the action. There was lots of mobilization across the country, more radical groups springing up everywhere. But then you got more repression. And December 1819, Parliament passed the notorious 6 Acts, which among other things forbade meetings of more than 60, allowed for unauthorized searches of private homes, sound familiar? That was for weapons, made it possible to be transported for seditious writing, and increased the stamp duty on periodicals so it was hard to buy stuff to read about it. But even so, Peterloo, as it was called, in ironic reference to the Battle of Waterloo, it did help establish the right to public meetings, we're gathering here, and contributed greatly to a moral consensus that parliamentary reform was necessary. And in 1832, you had the first of that, the Great Reform Act. So something came out of that suffering and that sacrifice. Even so, it went on being difficult. And what you had then was the beginning of, okay, if something's working out, we better clamp down on it. So you had people forming unions, which was legal, but then the government was worried that all these agricultural workers were joining unions, which they didn't really want them to do. So they made oath-taking, which was legal, and you had to take an oath to join a union. They made oath-taking illegal. And 6 people, famously, you might have seen movies or read books about it, famously got arrested for taking oath to join a union in Tolpuddle, and they were transported for 7 years, okay? But the good news is, again, protest around that made a difference. The public outcry, the petitions, the demonstrations meant that they were actually brought back after 3 years and given a full pardon. So protest can work. Now, it's very interesting that I've given you quite a repressive period of the 19th century. You come forward into the beginning of the 20th century, and the picture here illustrates Black Friday, when the police were so violent, they were just throwing back 119 women and a few men who were trying to get into Parliament non-violently. They weren't violent, but the police were throwing them back. They tried again. They were thrown back. Some of them were sexually assaulted. The outcry about the police treatment meant that when they all turned up in the magistrate's court the following day, Winston Churchill, our hero, favourite of many, Winston Churchill, then Home Secretary, said, okay, actually, we're not going to charge anybody because the public outrage had been so great. He said, no public advantage to be gained by proceeding with the prosecution. Very interesting response. Not the same kind of response that the people who actually were striking in this picture and who achieved what I hope you all had yesterday, a 2-day weekend, but the response to them was, as the sheriff of Lanarkshire was concerned because one red flag was flying in the crowd, he thought, insurrection. So he mobilized 10,000 troops, 6 tanks, and machine guns around St. George's Square. Now, I'm glad to say he didn't use them, but that mobilization showed that military presence went on for 2 weeks. Meanwhile, there were negotiations, 47-hour week was agreed, and we do have weekends today, again, thanks to non-violent protest. And this is one of my favorites. It's a lovely story. 600 young men, all communists. I got taught about this at school, but they didn't tell me they were communists. But the 600 young men decided that really we did have the right to roam around the countryside. And they decided to go on a mass trespass up Kinder Scout. What happened to them? Well, the gamekeepers just couldn't deal with it. It was too many. But the police moved in and they did arrest, and let me get that right, 5 people who were found guilty of breach of the peace and sentenced to 6 months, can you think about what people get today, hard labor. But again, a public outcry meant that people were shocked and disgusted and actually led to the national parks that I hope many of you continue to enjoy today. So again, non-violent protest in the face of repression still worked and achieved us important rights. Now let's just move across the Atlantic, because again, you have this pattern of if something is working and it's legal, how do we actually make it illegal? And a very famous example is in Montgomery, Alabama. I hope you recognize the top picture, which is Rosa Parks, famously. I know she wasn't the first person to sit down on the bus, but she's the one they decided to make public. She sits down, and she is breaking the law, let's be clear. She's breaking the local law, which says she can't sit in a white person's seat on a bus. So she gets arrested. And as a consequence, the population of Montgomery, the black population, say, well, we're going to boycott the buses, but it's tough to get to work. So they organize carpooling, which is perfectly legal. What do the local authorities do? They make carpooling illegal. But still, the population keep up the bus boycott, one of the most famous boycott actions. And boycotting wasn't made illegal, just carpooling. And after 381 days, the Supreme Court says in 1956 that segregation on public buses is illegal. So in spite of that repression and that method of repression, they won. Not so lucky, my friends, and one of my heroes, he's still alive today, Michael Randall is at the end of the picture, not so lucky, the Wethersfield 6. Now people know about, most of you, some of you a bit young, but you know, CND in the 1960s was a very big deal. And people were sitting down in Trafalgar Square in their thousands and also up in Scotland and being arrested on minor offences and dragged out the way if you look at the old TV pictures. What happened when they decided to organize a similar kind of action outside a nuclear base is that the government came in heavy. And this might be familiar to some people today. They decided to pick on the organizers. So they went for the 6 who were organizing the official secret, organizing to have the demonstration of thousands outside Wethersfield. They arrested them under the Official Secrets Act, which meant that the 5 men got 18 months in prison, which was considered a very long sentence at that time, and the woman got 12 months. And the demonstration did go ahead, some 5,000 people, they still demonstrated, and there were 800 arrests, but many people credit that repressive response to the kind of tail-off of the anti-nuclear movement in the mid-60s. So that's interesting. In a sense, you could argue that repression worked to a degree, because it certainly didn't stop us bringing in nuclear weapons. which is, I have to say, how I became involved. And I was involved in organizing, as a legal observer and a non-violence trainer, this very first action. I was an accident and emergency. It was my first hospital job. But I thought the Greenham women had marched from Cardiff to Newbury, where they planned to deploy cruise missiles, which were tactical nuclear weapons, which the United States could use in the event of a nuclear war, as if we were some kind of aircraft carrier. The nuclear weapons would be launched from here, secretly dispersed around the countryside, and that would deal with the problem. We really didn't like that idea, so having marched to the base, we decided to camp there and then to take action there. But I remember in the non-violence trainings that I was doing, in the legal briefings I was doing, I said, you know, the last people who did this kind of thing did get 18 months. They were breaking the Official Secrets Act. We are breaking the Official Secrets Act. But they didn't use it. It was very interesting. I remember standing there. They rolled women out the way. They did arrest on minor charges. Breach of the peace was a common one. 34 in the first blockade. And when 30,000 of us came and surrounded the base the following December, and then we embraced it on the Sunday, we blocked it on the Monday, again, rolling people out the way, minor arrests, again thinking, why aren't they using the Official Secrets Act? Why are they letting this go? And we got global attention. We wrote a chain letter to get everybody come. Can you imagine that? And we got global attention, and Mrs. Thatcher began to get very worried. But they did bring the missiles in. So we had to get more serious. So in 1983, along with hundreds of others, I decided I'd cut down this fence. I was going equipped with bolt cutters. I was arrested. I was charged with going equipped and quite a large amount of criminal damage. Jolly good, I could end up in a Crown Court. What did Mrs. Thatcher do? Mysteriously, my charges were dropped. And I had to end up in a magistrate's court, but I was allowed to use the defense of reasonable excuse that as a fireman, I was breaking down the door to put out that dangerous fire, and Richard was my Mackenzie, and I gave the whole, what would happen to Newbury if a nuclear bomb landed on it, and the horrifying medical effects of nuclear weapons, and the magistrate sat there and listened. He said, you're guilty, off to prison. No, he didn't say off to prison, he said £50 fine, £50 fine, quite a lot of £50 then. And I said, well, I'm not paying, and I went to prison for a few weeks. But very different. And what happened when two of my friends painted the Blackbird spy plane? They were due to appear in Crown Court, £10,000 worth of damage. Charges dropped. Mrs. Thatcher, like Winston Churchill before her, thought it was not really a good idea to have Greenham women in court making their defense. And she preferred, even though 4,000 of us were arrested, she preferred to drop charges and keep us out. And perhaps not surprisingly, as we were proving by wandering around Salisbury Plain, that these missiles were really not working because they were supposed to be deployed secretly. But there we were blocking them once they'd been there and throwing paint at them to show that they were not being deployed secretly. And then they'd arrest us and then they'd let us go. And I crawled in the base and they'd arrest you and then they'd let you go. So different to today. So it'd be very interesting to discuss why Mrs. Thatcher was behaving in a totally different way. But I'm very glad to say that in 1986, Gorbachev met with Reagan, and he said later, about 10 years later, he said, I went and met them because I trusted that the Greenham women and the peace movement would keep Reagan in line. And we had our first and only disarmament treaty, and the missiles were reviewed. Now, here's another interesting thing. I was reasonably well known. The Daily Mail wrote a horrible article about me, and so I got invited to Sandhurst and the Royal College of Defence Studies, where they have a one-year course on counter-terrorism. And they said, Dr. Jones, will you come and teach our boys, they're called our boys, police and army officers from all over the world, about non-violence and why it's not terrorism? I had a lovely time teaching them. And I asked them a question I'm going to ask you. How many of you here think it is completely wrong to break any law on any occasion? Okay, that's not how they answered. About 70% put up their hands, as you can imagine. I said, okay, how many of you here have ever parked on a double yellow line? How many do you think put up their hand? About 70%. Very interesting. I said, also, it's okay to break the law for your personal convenience when you think you're unlikely to be caught, but it's not okay to break the law when you're trying to do something for the greater good. And I always ask them to take away John Rawls's essay on civil disobedience as reading, because what happens today in court is people say, you live in a democracy, you don't need civil disobedience. Okay, suffragettes. Okay, those young men walking up Kinderskirt. Okay, even, Peterloo, whatever. That wasn't a democracy. We're a democracy now. Talk to your MP, vote in who you like. You do not need to break the law. But John Rawls points out so brilliantly that civil disobedience is a stabilizing device in a democracy. You either break a law that needs to change, like sitting at a lunch counter where you're not allowed to sit, or on a bus seat where you're not allowed to sit, and you hold up the law for the greater examination by the wider public and say, do you really think this is fair? And they go, no, actually it's not. Or you break a minor law. You sit in the road, you sit outside a gate and you say, look what's going on. The government is taking no action against this genocidal threat of the climate crisis or other threats that we're dealing with, or you hold up a cardboard sign, whatever it is, you draw attention to the wider injustice. And society goes, we don't like that. We want change. And that's what civil disobedience does. And that's what we need to do. Unfortunately, our then Home Secretary, I go back to Priti Patel because let's go back to 22, 23 when this first kind of legislation came in, and she made it quite clear that who she was going for was the climate movement and Extinction Rebellion. And why? Because the government had got a whole lot of stuff written for them on dealing with protest and dealing with terrorism. Interesting, even at that time they were associating it. And they had their special advisor, and who was he funded by? One of the think tanks heavily funded by the fossil fuel lobby. And as Caroline Lucas so powerfully says, it appears that the policing bill, I'm going to leave the bills and things to Richard to talk about, is stained with the grubby, oil-soaked hands of the fossil fuel lobby. And no wonder this cracks down on the fundamental rights of protesters to challenge the very climate-wrecking policies espoused by this downright dangerous industry. Thank you, Caroline. That really says it all. But luckily, we haven't given up. I'm very honoured and proud that one of the people who exemplifies how one person taking a small, seemed like small at the time, but can be big, action, can start a movement. Here is Trudy, and it's her birthday today. Trudy, Trudy, why did you hold that sign up? Why did you go up? Just tell us. I don't want to tell you a story. Just tell us.
Moral outrage.
At what?
At watching a certain judge moving the goalposts, rigging trials to secure convictions.
In climate activist cases?
In a climate activist case. So seeing people, really principled people, really passionate, principled people of integrity being silenced by a judge who is supposed to be independent. And watching this happen week on week, and watching him gradually moving the goalposts, every trial that was happening. And I saw it as sort of almost like coercive control. I thought it was a complete abuse of power, an abuse of process. I couldn't stand it. I had to do something. So I did that.
She held up a sign which quoted what was written on the walls of the Old Bailey, that jurors have a right to acquit according to their conscience. We're in a Quaker meeting house. They were Quakers. They had been put in prison, and it was public protest that got them released, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, it's an extraordinary story. I don't have time to tell the whole story here, but look it up if you don't know it. And Trudy just held up a sign, which in itself was perfectly legal, but you were then arrested, weren't you?
Yes.
And then she was acquitted, and it went to appeal, and she was acquitted again. Yes, is that right? Yeah, the process. Let me get the process right.
Go to appeal because the government changed.
The government changed. That's right. They were going to appeal it.
They were going to appeal it, and I was saved by the election, really.
And while all this was going on, I was sitting with friends outside Truro Crown Court, while I was supporting friends who were sitting outside all around the country. A movement called Defend Our Juries was holding up signs saying, juries, you have the right. Is that not right? A massive movement. And that was the beginning of Defend Our Juries, which Fiona is going to talk about more, so I'm not going to say a lot, but only to say they're now, of course, engaged in supporting people who for doing an action rather similar to what we did at Greenham, painting planes and other actions like trying to stop genocidal weapons being made. They've been described as terrorists because of criminal damage, and people who support them for holding up signs, as Fiona's going to explain, are themselves called terrorists. The whole complicated situation that we're in now is going to be described by Fiona, but it's now one of the biggest civil disobedience movements in the country. 2,700 people have been arrested since that prescribing of supporters of Palestine action has taken place. I'm not going to go into detail because there's a whole lot that's gone on, but I do find it interesting. I've put in that one of the people involved in this, our Prime Minister, he defended somebody in 2003 who did criminal damage to an aeroplane, one of the Fairford Five. And I, as my, he wasn't a friend, but someone I knew, Wing Commander Andrew Brooks wrote a letter to the Times saying, you know, we never saw the Greenham women who were doing lots of damage at our base and who had damaged this plane that I've told you about. We never saw them as terrorists. Of course, we risked being shot if we'd actually gone into the silos where the missiles were, and we didn't do that. But we did stop the silos in the missiles in the street. And it's extraordinary to have this wing commander write a letter on our behalf. It hasn't yet had any effect. I'm coming to the end, but I do want to point out another little bit of hypocrisy. Here's Yvette Cooper. If you can catch her, she's in the picture up there with a suffragette banner on. Now, I admire the suffragettes, but let's be clear that a small group of them, after those horrible pushbacks in 2010-12, a small group of them decided violence is the answer. And they involved themselves in arson, bombing, and assassination attempts. And here are the stats, which I actually looked up. If you want detail, I can go into it. But they openly called themselves terrorists and said terrorizing the British public is necessary. This is a group that she admires, and yet she's prescribing Palestine action. So I'm going to end here because I want to end on a hopeful note, because what I find really hopeful is that juries which represent the community, which represent the society, are now themselves engaged in nonviolent resistance. Again, Fiona will talk more about it, but I myself just sat through the trial of my 6 extraordinary friends in the picture here. What did they do? They went out 4 years ago and tapped on the glass early Sunday morning to crack it. Not a great deal of damage, but very symbolic because we were at the height of a heat wave that was going to kill thousands across Europe. And as doctors, they said, in case of emergency, break the glass. They wanted to draw attention to this problem. They went to court. The jury refused to convict. It was a hung jury. The prosecution was not satisfied, demanded a retrial, which took place this February. And I sat in court and I listened to the prosecutor tell the jury, it is your duty to convict. Your duty as jurors, your duty under your, I'm quoting, under your oaths and your affirmations, your duty to the community that you represent is to return true verdicts. And true verdicts are verdicts of guilty, however much that may you feel personally uncomfortable, however strongly you may be urged in speeches that follow mine to do otherwise. Your duty as jurors is to be true to verdict and return true verdicts according to the evidence. And all the defendants, of course, had already made powerful speeches. The judge on this account allowed speeches, but said these are not part of your defense, but you can speak. And this is my friend Juliet, a colleague, a wonderful consultant psychiatrist. This part, I can't give her whole speech. You can find them online. We spoke quite a bit of evidence about our duties. Medicine says we are duty-bound to intervene when we see a looming threat, to take the most effective action to save a life, even if it involves breaking the rules. We don't wait for the final moment, the arrival of the wildfire, the point of cardiac arrest, or when the person is on the bridge and about to jump. When the evidence is undeniable, medicine tells us not to wait any longer. It says we can't save the lives already lost, but what we do now will determine if it's 2 billion or 4 billion deaths within our lifetimes. The jury took less than 4 hours to find them all not guilty. Thank you very much.
Some questions you should should keep that. Yeah, thank you so much, Lynn. That was a wonderful tour of the history of protest and its suppression. And if there are any questions anyone would like to ask directly to Lynn, then please let us put your hand up and we will send a roving mic in your direction.
Thank you very much for that, Lynn. I want to ask, have you discerned any common characteristics between campaigns, actions which have been successful, and also common characteristics of actions which have been unsuccessful?
Oh, no. I thought you might going to say characteristics in common between past and present, and I can answer that, which is hanging in there when things seem really down, and there seems to be very few of that. And, 1984 in Greenham, we were being hosed at the fires, our fires thrown out, the community hated us, the press hated us. It seemed like women had given up on us, there were just a few of us left, and we hung in there. And I see this year, climate activist groups, this is the thing I'm most involved with, just like, where has everybody gone? And yet there's so much going on under the surface. So I see that commonality that you need to hang in there. But regarding failure, I haven't, because obviously in doing the research for the book, I looked more for successes to talk about. So I'm afraid that I didn't analyze a lot of failures. Nothing comes to mind. Do you have something in mind?
No, I just wanted to open up there.
Yeah, okay, but we can discuss more, yeah? Any other direct questions? No? I think we should go on to Fiona then.
So thank you so much, Lynn. Our next speaker is Fiona Godley, who is a medical editor, writer and campaigner. She was the editor-in-chief of the British Medical Journal from 2005 to 2021, and she now works to highlight the links between climate, nature recovery and public health. She's a Fellow of the Royal College of Physicians and the Academy of Medical Sciences, a Bi-Fellow of King's College, Cambridge, and a trustee of the Eden Project. She helped to establish and is an ambassador for the UK Health Alliance on climate change, and last year she was arrested under terrorism laws as part of the Defend Our Jury's protests in support of Palestine Action. Over to you, Fiona.
Thank you very much, Jason. Wonderful to be here. My talk is entitled Why I Broke the Law, and I should just say I feel a bit of a fraud in this company because there are many people here who've been arrested, and worse, it seems to me, from what I've heard. And I was just one of, as you've discovered, several thousand who have been arrested under terrorism laws for holding a cardboard placard, handwritten placard, saying, I oppose genocide, I support Palestine Action. And I think there's nothing very special about my case. As I've said, it's pretty minor as an episode compared with what others, and even others in this room, have experienced. But I think it is worth noting that, like many of my fellow protesters involved with these Defend Our Jury's protests, I had never been arrested before. And yet I and they went to the Defend Our Jury's protest with that as our sole objective. And something about that suggests something strange is happening. And this seems to me to be a very clear shift in me and my fellow protesters, but more importantly in the world around us, that would encourage people to go and involve themselves in that mass arrest. So why did I break the law? Just first of all then, a little brief about my background. I do have a Quaker heritage, which I'm extremely proud of and is relevant in this place. And I'm very glad of my links with the history of dissent that the Quakers represent. Many of you will know George Fox, the founder of the Quaker movement, was imprisoned at least 8 times between 1649 and 1673 for his beliefs, spending in total about 6 years in various English prisons, which must have been a pretty grueling experience. And he was persecuted for, in his case, refusing to take oaths, disrupting church services and preaching unconventional views on spiritual equality. Since then, the Quakers have, as I know you all know, shown their commitment to social justice in many different ways, speaking truth to power and making use of nonviolent direct action. And myself, I joined protests as a medical student, including for the campaign for nuclear disarmament. I was one of the people who we all turned up on Easter weekend and held hands round the Greenham base in 1983. And then after qualifying as a doctor, I came to understand that medicine was so much more than just treating disease. And it's about tackling health inequalities and social inequalities, including the environmental causes of ill health. And it was a formative experience for me attending and reporting on the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992, which was like the pre-COP, the COP0, if you like. And I have long had a view, shared by many, I know, that we need citizens' juries to help governments reach the brave and right decisions on crucial issues such as the climate crisis. When I became editor-in-chief of the BMJ in 2005, I saw that a key part of my role could be to use the very important platform reaching out to doctors in the UK and around the world to bring climate change into the medical mainstream. And by then it was abundantly clear that the climate crisis was a health crisis, is a health crisis, and that we should be discussing it as a public health issue, and that doctors as trusted professionals had a duty to raise awareness and advocate for change. And one of the things I perhaps was most helpful or substantial in that work was helping to set up the UK Health Alliance on Climate Change that Jason mentioned, which is a membership organisation of now over 50 UK-based health organisations, including the medical and nursing royal colleges, now representing over 1 million UK health professionals, helping the medical and health establishment speak with one voice. I considered it a bit like the radical arm of the medical establishment because it could never really do activism as such. It had to remain within the law in order to hold that broad church of established medics and use the voice and the trusted voice to make change. But when I retired from the BMJ at the end of 2021, I saw an opportunity to become more active within health for XR. And I have enormous admiration for all the many people I met during those protests, their commitment and their knowledge and their creativity, and learning so much. I know Tony Booth is here, heard you speak about how much you learn when you attend a protest. In fact, in many ways, it's one of the really important things about being there. So many people educating each other about, what's happening, what needs to happen. And then came Trudy, who, as I say, as we've said, it's so delightful to see you here, Trudy, who did that amazing thing, which was so simple and so active to the point that needed to be made. And the admiration we all have for you is immense, Trudy. So thank you so much, because I think, importantly, in your arrest you were handcuffed. I think we need to sort of remember that it was a pretty frightening experience, I expect. And then you had a year of being pursued by the government, by the Solicitor General, letters from lawyers. You didn't have the money necessarily to defend yourself as you might have wanted against such an onslaught. And it was a wonderful moment when there were the other people standing with their placards, saying the same thing, holding solidarity with you. That was fantastic, and we all witnessed that and thought, well, bravo, well done. And then the appeal and the letting off. But I think that action, certainly for people like me, was immensely powerful, and our gratitude to you is huge. And I was just going to talk a bit about Defend Our Juries because, in the midst of the worst horrors of Gaza, the government prescribing Palestine Action as a terrorist organisation, and the justification for this being so unconvincing, and the decision seeming just really wrong and so rushed, and using anti-terror laws for silencing the government's critics. Seemed authoritarian, undemocratic, and frankly absurd. And we had the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, calling the ban a disturbing misuse of UK counter-terrorism legislation. So it was a moment when many of us just thought, goodness me, what is going on here? And that upswelling of public disquiet and anger found its moment. And people like me who've never considered getting arrested before suddenly felt it was the only thing to do. But I think the safety in numbers was a big thing, and that's where I get on to Defend Our Juries, because there was a real sense of the support that organisation gave us, and carrying with it all the learning and experience and legal knowledge and courage from years of climate activism, but now pulled together under this wider umbrella of the legal issues that were needed to be really carefully looked at. And Martin, I don't know if I could ask Martin Fisher to take. Would you mind taking a microphone? Is there one we could? Because Martin has just told me that he was involved in all of that. The the leadership of Defend Our Juries was kind of decapitated when they did house arrests. They're not allowed to talk to each other, not allowed to talk to other people. They were kind of pretty much shut down.
So organising any of these sign-holding protests is done very responsibly, so there are legal briefings given to anybody who's considering holding a sign, and those are done via Zoom or some other platform, because the government shut down the Zoom account. And on one occasion last September, there were 7 people who made presentations to an audience of about 400 or 500, I believe, who were considering taking action. And the next morning, their homes were raided at dawn, and they were all arrested. They were then, those 7 people, they essentially decapitated the leadership of Defend Our Juries. Thankfully, others stepped in, but those 7 were prevented from communicating with each other or with Defend Our Juries by bail conditions. Bail conditions which required them to be at home at night as well, by dusk or something like that. I mean, essentially under house arrest and incommunicado. I mean, it's absurd. Those bail conditions were relaxed last week when it became evident that the hearing for them would be delayed until, because of the judicial review, the victory in the judicial review that said that the prescription of Palestine action had been ultra vires by the Home Secretary. That means that their trial is going to be delayed until next year, and therefore the bail conditions were relaxed. But until last week, they were under house arrest, more or less.
Thank you so much, Martin. I mean, that gives you a sense of the, it's a pretty intimidating thing to happen, to have house arrest at dawn, arrested at dawn, just for being on a Zoom call. I suppose I'm stressing the point that going to a protest with the intention of getting arrested is a very different thing to finding oneself unexpectedly in the hands of the police. Our intention was clear. Defend Our Juries made it very clear that we were explicitly there to waste police time, which again is not something I would normally have wanted to do. And we did it in whatever way we could. And just for the protest on the 6th of September that I was involved in London, over 2,000 police were involved, pulled in from Wales and Liverpool and around the country. And they clearly didn't want to be there doing that, but that was what they had to do. Now, since the arrests, most of us have now been charged under Section 13 of the Terrorism Act and receiving what are quite intimidating letters from the Metropolitan Police telling us to appear in court. I have actually been saved that because since the judicial review, along with others, where they found that the prescription of Palestine action was unlawful, the plea hearings have been halted, and so I haven't had to attend mine. But those who have attended their plea hearings have been involved in some amazing scenes, which you can look on YouTube and see, refusing to plead, many of them, and instead making fantastic statements, sometimes singing, reading poems, reading out the names of children who've been killed in Gaza, and refusing to stop speaking until they were physically removed from the court. So that in itself is a fantastic sort of act of courage and solidarity. And juries in other cases, as Lynn has said, have continued to reach so-called perverse verdicts, most recently in the retrial of the JP Morgan activists who were found not guilty last month, which was an amazing outcome. So protecting our right to peaceful protest and non-violent direct action seems now more important than ever. The climate crisis is about injustice, global injustice, generational injustice, and governments are not, our government is not being open and honest about the threats that we face. Most recently, it was only because of pressure from environmental groups that in January the government released its report on the security and economic threats from nature decline. And even then, they released only a summary. And the true and deeply concerning extent of the threats are detailed in the full report, and which is only now in the public domain thanks to investigative journalists at ITV. So the question, is dissent in danger? Yes, I believe it is. I think the conversation from Lynn, we're going to hear from Richard, I think dissent is in danger. Those protesting in order to raise awareness and hold the government to account are being silenced and criminalised for non-violent direct action in a way that is new. We must be allowed to protest against unjust laws and in support of health and social justice. Juries are made up of members of the public and are therefore in touch with the public mood in ways that judges and prosecutors are not. We must defend our right to peaceful protest, and we must defend juries' rights to make the, quotes, wrong decision. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Fiona. I think you maybe should just come back up in case there are any questions for you. Yes. Would anyone like to ask Fiona a question? Yeah, of course.
Thank you very much. Stirring and inspiring. Just wondering if you've encountered a renewed commitment to jury duty, something that many have tried to duck out of at times, and maybe this ennobilizes it and emboldens people once again.
But I guess a lot of people do try to get out of jury duty. I don't know how many people in this room have served on a jury. Perhaps we could have a show of hands. Okay. I mean, just for those on the camera, it's about 10 people, is it? Or about maybe a third of people, a quarter? And I mean, I'd rather love the idea, but I'm retired now, so it's easy. But I think the other point I wanted to make, I think I mentioned it earlier on, is about citizens' juries. And I'm absolutely certain in my own mind, and I'm not alone in this, and it's not a new idea, that would be a route to a much, much better set of political decision-making. And we know that in Ireland, the citizens' juries have been given statutory authority of some sort, which meant that they were much more substantial than simply a group of people, meeting to discuss something. I think a group of citizens with citizens' assemblies with their expert advisors and information, if they need it, when they need it, has to be a better way to make decisions on these very, very key issues.
Your last point about the citizens are closer to what's going on than the needs of the people is very important, I think. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. I'm Peter. What is the role of the police in this? Do they have any freedom of, deciding whom to arrest and on what basis? And to what extent does the government force the police to arrest people even if they don't want to?
Well, let me give my answer. There's others more knowledgeable than me, but my answer would be that the police do have discretion. And that was shown, as I understand it, by the fact that in Edinburgh, where there were Defend Our Juries protests, there were no arrests. Whether the law in Scotland is different. But and actually, it was a very patchy process. I mean, Tony, you were there. Others who they dived in with their phalanx of 12 police officers, targeting people at sort of moderately at random. They didn't manage to arrest everyone on the day I was there. If darkness fell, the moon was up, and they had torches. It became a rather kind of carnival atmosphere. By the time I got back from my kind of being processed, they were still arresting people. But there are other people who'd wandered off, with their signs, gone off on the tube. It wasn't at all a systematic process. And so I think that was part of what was so powerful, was that actually the police thought they were doing it, and then they basically failed. I mean, they couldn't do it because there were too many of us.
Down in Cornwall, they chose not to arrest at all at one action. Does anybody have more detail about that? They have arrested at a later action, but they just chose not to arrest. So
I think they did have discretion, is what we're saying, yeah.
Right, Clive from Defend Our Juries. The police have broad discretion on how they apply the law, so they can ignore something, they can give people words of advice, they can arrest somebody. What we saw with the Lift the Ban campaign is that in London, where the Chief Constable was Chief Constable because his predecessor had been kicked out, because they'd lost the confidence of the Home Secretary, we saw a very political response where they said, we're going to arrest everybody, absolutely everybody. And they brought police in from all over the place. It was very noticeable that those police appeared once. And then once they'd sent officers there and they'd report reports back, they weren't willing to send officers again. around the country, other places, they arrested people initially in England, and then when they saw in Scotland they were choosing not to, then they started backing away from arresting people. And what they started doing was just taking photographs and saying, we're gathering evidence. And so you see that there is wide discretion on what the police choose to do, but you also see in London the politicisation of the policing there.
I think people in Edinburgh were not arrested at the time, but were arrested subsequently, I believe.
Oh, I don't know.
Yes, yes.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
It was sort of wildcat tactics, you know, where they thought, yeah, and they were raiding houses. They were, and they are pursuing people still.
Okay, that's helpful to know.
Yeah.
Makes more sense, at least.
Okay, I mean, I think when the story is written, I think that something changed with the August arrests in Parliament Square, because originally the idea had been that people would sit for 1 hour and then go, and the police during that hour were quite slow. They arrested a few people. They imagined everyone would go. I think that the whole thing changed when there was an upsurge and people didn't want to go, and they thought, we'll stay. And then I suspect that there was communication with whoever, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner and so on, and then everybody was arrested, and then subsequently everybody stayed and everybody was arrested. So I think that, anyway, there was a shift and a change of tactics, yeah.
Just going back to jury service, I was astonished by how few people here actually have been served on jury. I've been eligible for jury service now for 67 years, 69 years, and my wife and I both protested we've never been asked. And my question would be, does anybody in the room have the sense that I have, that somebody is marking our cards and we're not being picked up? Because although we've got one case of criminal damage, my wife was done for criminal damage on painting a bridge as usual, it's that's the only case, and that was quite late on. We could have easily done, but we've been protesting forever.
I think maybe you have been blacklisted. What do people think?
Yeah, I was sent to jury service, but on one occasion, the second occasion, I was challenged. And I noticed I was the only person with long hair not wearing a tie. I don't know. But you can be challenged. They can, the prosecution or the defence can challenge as the juries are sworn, taken in.
But no longer the peremptory challenge has been abolished. There's only challenge for cause nowadays. They have to give a reason to challenge you.
Yeah, I'm going back to the 80s.
Okay. We don't have the voir dire like the Americans do, where the trial's over almost before you've picked the jury. But we don't have that extensive questioning that the Americans do.
Great, well thank you so much, Fiona. And now we'll move on to our third speaker to carry on thinking about these issues. Oh, I'm being dazzled. Richard Vogler is Emeritus Professor of Criminal Law and Criminal Justice at the University of Sussex, having worked for the first half of his career as a criminal defence lawyer. And his research and writing interests include criminal procedure, public order and criminology. And his first book was entitled Reading the Riot Act, on the history of public protest and the army and the magistrates. Over to you, Richard.
Right, after the inspiring protesters, we get the stuffy lawyer, I'm afraid. And I've been asked to give a 2-minute rundown on protest law, and I'll try and do that and then move on to talk about what's happening to our juries. Okay, let's not go away with the impression that there was ever a golden age of protest. Those of you who remember the 1981 inner city disturbances or the 1984 miners' strike will know that policing has always been discriminatory and brutal and sometimes racist in relation to public disorder. We have had a flurry of legislation over recent years because of various political reasons, but we've had a long history of debate and conflict about whether our streets are the King's highway and we use them under sufferance and we do what the King would like us to do, or whether these streets belong to us and that the judgment of what is appropriate in the streets should be for us as the community. If you like, is it the King's parade or is it the people's parade? And this is a crucial issue, I think, in relation to what we think about the laws of protest. Imran Khan, KC, has argued that this is a moment. What I've said that, you know, we have a long history of this, but nevertheless, there's an awful lot going on in protest law at the moment. Just last month, we've had the Justice Report on Protest and Public Order. We've had the Human Rights Watch report in February again, and also in February, the Downs report on police powers and protests. And in December last year, the government launched an independent review with Ken MacDonald, former DPP, to have an independent review of protest legislation. It was supposed to report before we got the crime and policing bill, but nevertheless, it hasn't, as far as I know, he hasn't reported yet. We also, as you know, had the first reading, the second reading of the crime and policing bill a week ago, and we've got the appeal on the High Court decision on prescription ongoing. So we are at quite an important moment in the history of the policing of protests in this country. And what happens over the next few months is going to be incredibly important. The origins of our contemporary law, and I'm sorry, I'm going to give you a quick potted lecture of how protest law has developed. The origins of our modern law is probably the Public Order Act 1936, and I think it's worth remembering as a basis for this debate that this came out of the Cable Street riot when the British Union of Fascists marched through East London, through the Jewish parts of East London, to try and intimidate and abuse the local community. And one of the important elements of protest law is that we do not want people who are going to intimidate and to threaten and to be abusive and to spread hate on our streets. And protest law has to stop that. And it's important that we distinguish between people who are peacefully protesting legitimate positions and people who are out to intimidate. And I think that's quite important. It gave us Section 5 of the Public Order Act, threatening and abusive or insulting words, a statutory form of breach of the peace, which has become the basis for modern protest law. And of course, we remember the other really important element, which is the European Convention rights and our convention rights to under Article 10 for freedom of expression and our Article 11 rights of freedom of peaceful assembly and freedom of association with others. These are statutory rights which are in our legislation under the Human Rights Act 1986, as well as being in the European Convention. Of course, these are not absolute rights. There are derogations from those rights, which can be enforced by governments on the basis of legitimate aims such as national security, public safety, etc. These are not absolute rights. And of course, the major derogations that we've had in recent years, this flurry of legislation, certainly in my lifetime, we've never seen so much legislation on public order. The Public Order Act 1986, the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act 2022, Public Order Act 2023, and the Crime and Policing Bill, which is in front of us now. A mass of legislation, incredibly complex legislation, which has come out over recent years to cover different types, or to try and attack different types of protest. Who decides who should be on the King's parade? It is the officers of the King, the ministers and police of the King, because it is, of course, a criminal offence not to notify the police in advance of a protest march. And the police can impose conditions, e.g. as to route on demonstrations. Obviously, we want them to do that in cases where we want to keep them away, keep racists away from mosques and things like that. But nevertheless, it's clear that these rights have not been necessarily imposed in an appropriate way. And it's a criminal offence to break these conditions, even if you were unaware of them. Even if you didn't hear the police saying you cannot go down here because you had headphones on or whatever, or you weren't present when they were being announced, you can still be prosecuted for breach of those conditions. And as you probably remember, in 2023, the serious disruption of the community regulations put in these new provisions, really saying that conditions could be put expanded to include any non-minor disruption of day-to-day activities, including merely making a journey, delivering time-sensitive products, and slow marching was obviously the target here. But those regulations, you remember, got quashed by the High Court in 2024, but they're coming back in the Crime and Policing Bill, which is currently before Parliament. So we'll wait and see what happens to that. And of course, police can ban protests outright. They can apply to the local authority for a ban on a protest for 3 months, where there are reasonable grounds to believe that their powers are insufficient to prevent the risk of public disorder. Special provisions in Parliament Square, etc. The recent Al Quds demonstration was banned under that power. A quick run through of public order offences. There are so many of these. I would keep you all night if we went through these. Just as a cherry pick of some of them. Participation in riot, causing intentional harassment, alarm and distress, threatening and abusive behaviour under Part 1 of the 1986 Act. Damaging and climbing on war memorials. Harassment, to persuade people to do something under the Protection for Harassment Act. Obstruction, we've already talked about, Section 137 of the Highways Act. Aggravated trespass, there's Caroline Lucas getting arrested at the fracking protest. Trespassing on land and intimidating the landowner or deterring or disrupting them from carrying out lawful activity. Refusing to remove the face covering, those provisions are going to be reinforced in the 2026 Act. Public nuisance, risking or causing serious harm to the public, including death or personal injury, etc., etc. We also have civil injunctions, which some of you will be very familiar with, where private companies, such as petrochemical companies, can apply for warrants in court with a penal notice attached to them, which means that people can get arrested. Okay, so this is a very powerful weapon that private bodies have to, you think of big organizations which have properties all over the country. They can stop people demonstrating on them or trespassing on them and get people arrested for so doing. And governments have a power to issue injunctions, and there is this new serious disruption prevention orders from 2023. Protesters who are repeatedly causing disruption, and public space protection orders and dispersal orders requiring an individual to leave an area for 48 hours. So there's a huge, complex panoply of regulations I've only really been able to scratch the surface on, because I wanted to come in my presentation to something that we have talked about already, which is the threat, the current serious threat to the community having a role in deciding what is acceptable on our streets, which is the David Lammy's plans to lose our right to elect jury trial for offences that carry a sentence of up to 3 years, having cases decided by this sinister concept of the swift court, and the complete loss of jury trial for offences that carry a sentence of up to 2 years. This was successful in its second reading last week, and it's anticipated that there is going to be a reduction in jury trials by 50% overall. Okay, the more serious offences are going to stay with juries, but we're losing 50% of those trials, which I think is incredibly important, because we have underfunded the criminal justice system for decades. So what do we do about it? Let's cut jury trials. It's like, the NHS being underfunded and saying, oh, well, we'll deal with that by not treating cancer patients at all. It's just taking away something which is fundamental to the system. And as far as my research and work in criminal justice is concerned, and I do a lot of work abroad on criminal justice, it seems to me that it's not about the confrontation between the state and the individual, because it should be, to be legitimate, about a relationship between the state, the community, and the individual. And all of those three ideologies and powers should be involved in criminal justice. And what you see in countries that have no community involvement is the loss of legitimacy in criminal justice. And I would argue that this community role, however we have it, is incredibly important. And I'm going to suggest 3 quick reasons why it is so important that we have public participation, popular participation in criminal justice. First of all, the people are really good at it. And there's a lot of research going back to the 1960s, particularly Calvin and Zeisel, showing that if you ask juries and professional judges to consider issues, something like 90% of the time they have exactly the same outcome. And who's to know for the other 10% the juries weren't right and the judges were wrong? And even in complex cases, that's true. And studies after study after study since Calvin and Zeisel have replicated those results, showing that juries are incredibly accurate in decision-making. There's a lot of psychological research about groups, showing that groups of people do much better at finding who's telling the truth. That they're better at problem solving with different views being discussed and debated. And equally, having diversity in a jury is incredibly powerful. Now, clearly, in having a judiciary deciding cases, they are not diverse. And something like 50% of them have followed the same route from public school to Oxbridge. These people do not represent us as a whole. They have not the same experience of us. They don't know the way that we live. And juries do. And having different perspectives in a jury make them more accurate fact finders, which is really what they're there to do. And research on that by Bergold and Bulcavera show that the results are really startlingly clear. And also we know that juries are good for us. They enfranchise us. And there's research showing by Gassel and Weiser showing that jury service measurably increases the level of participation in public life of a number of other areas, including voting and engagement with public services. In other words, as de Tocqueville said, the jury is a free school that teaches us about our rights and helps us to engage more in the public life. It's incredibly important in that respect. As Albert Zuhr, who's a great champion of juries, says, it brings otherwise attenuated people into contact with suffering human beings, draws attention to the ways laws and police and institutional structures prolong that suffering, and makes possible, though does not guarantee, greater awareness among participants of their own responsibilities for laws and policies and structures that treat people humanely. In other words, they teach us about what's happening in our society and put the responsibility on us for deciding how that should be resolved. There's a lot of debate about how democracy is really essential, or public participation in decision-making is really essential. There's Jürgen Habermas, the great prophet of communicative rationality, people getting together to chat about things, to talk about things and make decisions, such as the juries that we've talked about in Ireland and so on. That this gives legitimacy to decision-making, and it makes decision-making much more effective, and it is the bedrock of democracy. A lot of people would say having people talk about the enforcement of the laws is actually more important than having democracy in the creation of the laws, and that both of those are really important, but the enforcement is even more important. The third issue is what I call rational disorganization. Juries break up the circuits of power in our government. They're outsiders. Nobody's going to be pressurizing them into making a decision because it's good for their career. Judges and lawyers, etc., all have a career investment in cases, and if we're difficult and if we're not giving the right answers, then we're going to pay in our careers. And the juries perform a rational disorganization. They threaten self-serving and potentially corrupted circuits of bureaucratic authority, which we have seen everywhere, from the post office scandal to the Metropolitan Police. We know corruption is endemic in all of our institutions. It's what institutions do. And if you have insiders deciding about that, they're going to be part of that authority. Juries come in from outside and they apply fresh common sense reasoning to procedures and practices which have become stultified by practice and unquestioned by time. Juries are wonderful about being outsiders in that system. And they also perform another wonderful function, which is that if you go to a court in which there are no jurors, the lawyers get together and they talk lawyer talk, and the judge reaches a judgment. And the defender has no idea what's happening in their trial. But juries force us lawyers to talk in ways that people can understand, and therefore the defendant can understand. And that seems to me a human right, that a defendant should actually understand what's going on in their trial. And juries create that world. Chakravarti says that they're a weapon against the tyranny of state and against the tyranny of police officers. And no jury, says Roy Amlott, can be forced to implement what it considers to be a harsh law. In this way, a jury plays a vital part in the democratic process. And it's not, as so many people argue, we don't need juries anymore because we have democracy. Seems to me that's utterly nonsensical. We need juries now more than ever. Here we have a nice picture that you'll recognize. I want to say a word about nullification, because every jury is told that they must decide a case faithfully on the evidence. That's the oath that jurors take. It changed from the 1867 oath, which was they had to decide conscientiously. They didn't want that word, and they took that out. And of course, a jury can be prosecuted for reaching a decision not on the evidence. But how are you going to prosecute them, because the jury discussion is secret? And it always struck me as bizarre that the judges lie to the jury and say, you have to decide on the evidence and only the evidence, knowing full well that a jury can decide on whatever grounds they want to decide in the jury room. And the jury have to lie to the court, because if they tell the truth and say that they decided on conscience, they can be prosecuted. So it's just this bizarre situation of everybody lying about it, but everybody knows that, as Trudy has demonstrated to us, a jury, the whole point of a jury is deciding on its conscience, to stop oppressive prosecutions, to stop unconscionable prosecutions. That's what juries are there for, and they're brilliant at doing it. And yet this kind of don't say, don't tell situation goes on. Of course, it's slightly problematic in the sense that jury equity, as it's called, can work both ways. The famous Emmett Till case in America, where a bunch of racists murdered Emmett Till, and then when they got into the court, the white jury was told, you know, if you're a good Anglo-Saxon, you're not going to convict these guys, and they didn't. So jury nullification can work both ways. It can protect racists if you have a racist court. But then again, if it had been a single judge court, the judge was a racist too, so it wouldn't have made any difference, in fact. But we need to be a little bit careful with that argument. But I'll leave you with William Penn from Bushell's case saying in 1670, "You are English men." He didn't say women, but he should have done. "Mind your privilege. give not away your right. We are faced with this huge challenge today of giving away our right. Let's not forget that, you know, we've talked about political change coming from demonstration. It also has come from juries. The juries in 1688 made the country ungovernable and produced the Glorious Revolution. The juries in America at the time of the American Revolution, Zenger's case, etc., and the Navigation Act cases, made the country ungovernable before the revolution, and they created the American Revolution. Juries can create political change, and many of our rights about freedom of expression, etc., come from jury decisions, and we really desperately need them, and Lammy should not take them away.
Thank you so much, Richard, for a wonderfully lucid presentation. And so I think if there are direct questions for Richard, we should take those first. But if our speakers would like to come back to somewhere near the centre ground, and then we can broaden things out.
Law is a site of conflict, and it should be a site of conflict. It's what it's about. And I remember back in the 1980s with the peace movement cases, we had meetings around the country to try and dissuade people from taking appeals on issues which are going to be relevant to protesters up to the Court of Appeal, where positive law would be made, such as we've had in relation to the criminal damage in the Attorney General's reference number 1 of 2023, which blocked having arguments in criminal damage about long-term consequences. It's dangerous. Law isn't about positive law only. There are lots of other influences involved. Common sense from the jury, the human rights of the defendant, those are all at play in a court, and that's really how it should be. If positive law dominates everything, we're in big trouble, as they were in Germany in the 1930s.
Question from Jane.
Yes, thank you. I think this is sort of in a way on the same thing, but just a sort of historical, just factual thing. The thing on the wall of the Old Bailey has always struck me as absolutely wonderful. It's, so to speak, as it were, the official law recognising that they need the things that you were speaking of in your last few slides. I mean, the public to be on board, the community to come along with. At least I took it to mean that at some point some group of lawyers had thought that, some very central, powerful group of lawyers had thought that, and put up this notice about jury equity to remind everybody of it. But I'm wondering, am I right? How did that notice come to be there?
Victorian.
Victor, and I mean, what part does it play in legal education? I mean, as we've heard, interestingly over here, there are these very different views about law. So
it came from a time when juries were white, middle class, and male, and therefore they were a bulwark of the Constitution and celebrated. In the 1970s, we had democratization of juries all around the world. And from that time on, they've been a target of attack from government and elite groups all the time.
I wonder whether you agreed with me. It seems to me that there was a time when it was the word of the king, and the word of the king was law. And then there were barons, and the barons took the king to Runnymede, and they forced him so that the barons had some rights. And then there were lords, and the lords had some rights. And then eventually we got to the point where ordinary people had representation in Parliament. And now we're moving against that. Whenever ordinary people try and speak back in between election cycles, there's more and more repression of protest. And along that path, the next logical step is to remove people from juries. And we're now heading towards an age where we have new age barons, and we have new age kings, and we have the centralisation of power back towards the politicians and the elite. Do you agree that's the cycle that we are on?
I think there's always been a conflict. I mean, we've had juries since the 12th century, and there's always been back and forth between them, and juries waxing and waning in political importance. But I agree with you that if we lose this now, this is going to be incredibly important and dangerous for us. And as you say, these large conglomerates, we're moving into the age of the international conglomerate, and they are a defence against them, just as they were against the Stuart monarchy and other periods of our history. It's important now as it was in the time of the Civil War, in my view, if not more so.
And I just wanted to jump in there with remind you, and it's a really useful quotation. The 1950s, I don't know what was going on in the 1950s, but it pushed Lord Devlin to make this extraordinary, powerful statement that juries are the lamp by which freedom lives. They are our citizens' assemblies in miniature that challenge singular authority. And I love that quote because it says it all. What do you think, Richard?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
On the money. Good old Lord Devlin. But again, he was talking about a jury that was white, middle class and male.
It was, but if he was talking about that, even so, he was saying this is what challenges the tyranny of Whitehall.
Well, thanks very much. First, what came to mind was a witticism from G.K. Chesterton, something along the lines of when society wants something grand and important, it brings in experts. When it wants something really important, like weighing truth and innocence or guilt, it calls 12 ordinary people. But part of that is, I want to speak up for conscience, which is being brought up as well, because surely rooted in Abrahamic faiths is the sense that the law is written in the heart, and that conscience is something of the spark of the divine. That tradition has the sense that you have to listen to every person, and where you pull more together, you try to even out the oddities to get to the truthism. But I don't know if you all want to talk about that, because part of the jury tradition is to let truth come through the ordinary people.
Do you have any thoughts why the government decided to bring this in? I mean, David Lammy, in recent past, has been talking about how important juries were and now it's being rushed through. Do you have any idea why the governments are doing it, given they must know things that we all know about juries and why they're so important?
Well, obviously the use of juries by protest movements is important, but I think also the problem of the difficulty in prosecuting sexual violence cases has been really important. And as was said in the debate on second reading, it's been weaponized to attack juries. The fact that sexual violence cases have taken so long and the results are not good, juries tend not to convict sexual predators as much as they probably should, has been one of the factors that's driven it. And above all, it's money. It's about the fact that we've underfunded the criminal justice system so drastically for so long that it's a cost-cutting exercise, and it's intended to make, because cases are taking so long to get to trial now, and it's argued that if we take away juries, then cases will come before swift courts and be dealt with quickly, which, justice delayed is justice denied. So those are the arguments, and that's why I guess it's happened now, and I'm sure that the protest issue is a big issue in that too.
Thank you, Richard. You mentioned Article 10 and Article 11.
I did.
But we are talking about juries and conscience. What about Article 9? Does that come into play? Article 9 is freedom of conscience.
Yeah, I'm not sure how you'd use that argument in relation to juries. It's kind of more about religion than juries, but it's certainly an argument, it's an interesting argument that you could pursue in relation to juries. But, in most cases, people aren't on juries, so they don't have that exercise of freedom of conscience. It's an interesting point, though.
Clearly, there's a huge backlog, as we talked about, in the courts, which needs addressing. I'm wondering, has anybody considered, I've not seen it referred to at all, the possibility of an amnesty for people awaiting trial, certain people awaiting trial? I mean, the obvious people, to my mind, to be offered amnesty are the sort of people that are represented here. Freedom, people who are threatened with kind of freedom of conscience issues. Has this been thought of at all as a partial solution? And also, what, in terms of the impact that might have on the juries, on the justice system, what proportion of people awaiting trial at the moment are actually accounted for by these freedom of conscience issues? Is it significant or is it immaterial?
It's pretty small compared with the weight of criminal prosecutions in other areas in more serious crime and in sexual offences and so on. The prisons of conscience are pretty small in relation to that overall. So having amnesties in respect of, I mean, we can't have amnesties in respect of sexual offenders and sexual predators. We can't have amnesties in respect of burglars or murderers. Juries at the moment take high-end crime. They don't take lesser stuff. And I'm not sure how that would work. I haven't heard debates about it anyway.
Thanks for a really interesting set of presentations and inspiring as well. I guess kind of taking the idea that, in fact, dissent is in danger, I'm interested a little bit to focus on what you think, in particular Richard, but actually everybody, what you think the real issue is. Is it that there is a move afoot to undermine jury trial? Is that the thing we should be focusing on? Is it actually the fact that there's an increasingly ridiculous list, or whatever your words were, the increasing number of prescribed activities, barely being able to sneeze in public, if that's considered a prescribed activity pretty soon? Or is it the institutions and governance that are around this, lawyers, judges, how judges behave, how they interpret the law, how they give instructions, how the police behave, spy cops as an example, right? What is really the issue here? And once we've identified that, probably the most important question is then what do we do?
I mean, listening to the presentations, I think, I mean, this is a sort of, it seems like this is a multifaceted problem. I don't think we should boil it down to a single issue, but it does seem as though, I mean, one thing that's come across is the way that overreach creates possibilities for protests. So that if you can trap the authorities into certain kinds of overreach, and then you can sort of perform some kind of jiu-jitsu move on them, and that's what's happened so brilliantly with Defend Our Juries. I think this is a sort of they have created protest laws which are a kind of reductio ad absurdum of the protest law. So that's a kind of a huge opportunity, and I think that's created. So I think it's just keeping things fluid and open and seeing where the possibilities lie. But I think you're right. There's a huge systemic, sort of, multiple problem that we're confronting. I think a lot of it is not going to go away anytime soon. I mean, some of the really systemic issues just baked in, I think. Sorry, I spoke for longer than I could possibly have imagined that I would.
Can I just say, I'm not sure that, I mean, we've all lived through dark times before, and we have seen things improve, we've seen things get worse. And the idea that we're moving, inexorably towards chaos and a kind of totally authoritative regime seems to me unfounded. That that courts, in order to function, our concept of courts in this country, they have to be a site of conflict. They have to resolve conflict. There have to be different engagement within those courts. And lawyers can do some things and not others. And unrepresented defendants can do some things and not others. And positive law you can always find a way around it, and it's a constantly changing thing. And there are always ways that we can find a way around it. There are good judges who will let you do things, and there are bad judges who will shut you up the whole time. And there are always cracks in the system, and there are decent people in the system who will help you. And although things are getting more difficult at the moment, there are ways around it, and there are strategies that we need to think about to use in order to effectively promote our arguments through the measures that we have, through the opportunities that we have. And we have to go on doing that. It's a continuing struggle, in my view.
So what do you recommend, Richard?
More strategic use of the courts, and thinking carefully about what we can do and what we can't do in the courts, and who can do what in the courts, and what the lawyers can do and what the defendants can do. We can, you can introduce arguments. Judges can try and shut you up. Judges can shut up lawyers more than they can shut up defendants. And it's looking at what has worked and what hasn't worked in some cases, the question from over there, and trying to learn from other people's experiences of how you can get to talk to juries and get acquittals. It's a learning process, and it's a very, there are lots of opportunities in law. Law is not just a monolithic, positive creature. It's got lots of cracks and fissures in it.
And talking of shutting up, I think we're about to run out of time.
Oh.
So this conversation could run and run, I know, and I'm sure it will carry on after this session, but I think that's a really a fabulous note to end on, this kind of note of conflict and the importance of the need for ongoing engagement in the conflict. There are some copies of Lynn's book if anyone would like to come and check it out. Thank you all so much for coming. It's great to have such a wonderful audience and for your questions. And thanks again to our wonderful speakers.